Welcome to the latest Seahawks Draft Blog live stream. Rob Staton and Jeff Simmons here reacting to what has been a very, in my opinion at least, a very successful 2023 NFL draft for the Seahawks. We'll talk about the class and we'll talk about what's next, given there's the news today that Poona Ford has signed with the Buffalo Bills. So he certainly won't be coming back. It does seem to still be a bit of work needed on the defensive line. So, Jeff, let's start with the draft itself. What are your thoughts on the class on the whole, the 2023 draft?
I was really encouraged by the draft. We spent so much time this year on prospects and how they can go about it. And I really liked what they did on day one. I think what they did on day one was very encouraging. I think it was one of their best hauls of day one. And I know a lot of people were thrown off when Witherspoon's name came off the board. I was not. Me and you have been talking about him for a while. A lot of national reporters had tied him to the Seahawks, but to come out of day one with those two guys who are some of the few guys that have that blue chip ceiling. And if you'd listen to any of my shows, Jackson Smith and Jigba was a guy that I was really hoping the Seahawks would take. I didn't think they would. I thought it was too much of a luxury pick, to be honest. But when they drafted him, I jumped out of my couch. And I haven't had a reaction like that basically in this entire regime. So we'll do what they did in day one. Listen, everyone would have liked to see them come out, get defensive linemen early, do that, but that's not how it always works. You can't just draft the player because they fall there. You have to draft how your board falls. And overall, I thought, especially what they did on day three, one of the key signs for me coming out of this draft was I really wanted them to build positions of strength. I think the thing of the roster last year was they didn't really have a lot of those. They had some good players. They had a good draft last year. The two tackles were pretty good. So a big theme for me was offensive line. So I was a little discouraged coming out of day two that they didn't draft an offensive lineman. And day three just completely brought me back because they were able to hit the right guard and the center, who I thought they could have drafted Anthony Bradford with that third-round pick they traded away. And I wouldn't have batted an eye. So coming out of what they did, they didn't take an early probably pick on a interior defensive line, but I love the players they got. Basically from top to bottom. Even their seventh-round pick really excited me. I like Kenny McIntosh a lot. So top to bottom. And if you had studied this draft or really put in time, like I know you have, Rob, they didn't make one pick I had to Google. So for the Seahawks, that's a little different. And they took players, the whole day three were just logical players, and they stuck to their theme. And you were all over the character and the next phase of leaders. They really, really hit from top to bottom. And you see the grades that come out. It's either A or A plus right now, basically across the league. And when you see the class from top to bottom, and I was one I kind of overreacted after day two. I was a little discouraged because of that offensive line thing. But day three, I thought they absolutely crushed. I thought they did a great job on day three. And I was a little surprised they didn't trade down any of the first four picks. But overall, I really, really, really like what they did.
Yeah, I was a big fan of it across the board. I think that what I've always said, Jeff, is I just want to see a plan. You know, I want to be able to sort of look at a draft and think, I understand what the plan is here. It feels very character-centric. It feels like they're trying to get a certain type of person in the locker room, a certain type of physicality back on the field. I think for the first time in a number of years, you can look at the edge rush, and no one's going to mistake Darrell Taylor or Derek Hall or Boya Mafe or Uchenna Nwosu for Nick Bosa, but at least they've got those guys rather than Benson Mayowa and Bruce Irvin. You know, they actually they've invested in those pass rushing positions to try and create the kind of pass rush that they need to have. You know, I think that the hard hitting nature of Devin Witherspoon is going to just be fun to watch. I'm looking forward to seeing him play. Like you, I didn't expect them to draft Jackson Smith and Jigba. I was a little bit lower on him because of the speed, but I understand why they've taken him. And when people have described it to me, it's something that I perhaps overlooked. I didn't think a team would draft a receiver in round one purely to play in the slot. I always kind of felt like if you were going to draft, acknowledging as well, by the way, that the slot is a very important position in the modern NFL, but I thought that anybody taking him in the first round would sort of view him as somebody who could play outside, could play, you know, in the slot, can play in a variety of ways. And I was skeptical that with his lack of straight line speed, he often gets caught from behind when he's running away from people, that would be an issue. But it does make some sense for Seattle to have your two main key receivers outside and him inside as a third slot option. I've seen him compared to Julian Edelman And the more you sort of listen to those opinions and how he fits in Seattle, you think it's almost a perfect fit for the player and the team. And now you wonder how people are going to guard DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, the tight ends that they've not got an elite tight end, but they've got a group that they can use and utilize. I think both running backs can be used in the passing game as well. Kenny McIntosh certainly can be if they can find a way to get him involved. So there's a plan there, Jeff, that I can sort of see the thought process with it, and I like that about this team. And I think the fact that they, for 2 drafts in a row now, have not forced anything as well, Jeff, is important. You know, the LJ Collier pick is the hallmark of we need a defensive lineman. Who's left? We're taking him. And you think of all the players that I mean, if this Seahawks were drafted in 2019, they may have AJ Brown and DK Metcalf right now. So it's a very different mindset, and it's a mindset that means, in my opinion, Jeff, I don't know if you agree, they're going to avoid missing out on talent in the future if they persevere with this plan.
Yeah, it's really encouraging that they have seemed to learn some things from their mistakes. And you've more than anyone talked about the Malik McDowell, Jalen Carter thing. That they certainly learned a lot from that pick. And if you look at even the 2017 draft as a whole, that's a draft that used to kill me as a Seahawks fan. Like, they could have come away with so much talent in that draft, and they were trying to get cute, and they did so many little things. The 2019 Collier thing is the perfect example, where they trade Frank Clark away, and rather than drafting, the draft got away from them that year. And if you want to watch a weird press conference, put on Pete and John after that draft. They looked shell-shocked, and they denied that they were caught off guard, and they made an awful pick. He was basically a league minimum player at this point after his rookie contract, and it's one of the worst first-round picks in the NFL the last couple of years. He did next to nothing. I don't think he flashed a single play. So it's really encouraging to see. I know me and you have kind of stressed a lot in the last couple of years, just some of their planning in terms of free agency and some of their roster planning, even this year, where it left the interior defensive line really bare, and where they started to fall into some of their same patterns. And I was with you right there. There was a lot of reasons to be concerned, man. I think the most encouraging thing is what you said. They've built now some real areas of strength on their team. The reason I liked Smith and Jigba the most was because of how he complemented their other guys. And when I studied their cap, they had DK and Lockett. They're both making around $16 million this year, which is really good value for receivers on the cap, considering where the market went last year. In 2024, they both go up to over $23 million. So to me, there was a huge need to add a rookie contract. I know a lot of people were hoping they would pay someone in free agency. I thought that would be a mistake unless it was a one-year contract. So to me, they had to get a receiver. And then the more I started doing these simulators, and I tried Pro Football Focus, I tried Pro Football Network, the thing I noticed with the 20th pick is that seemed to be a pivot point in this draft. And if they didn't get Will Anderson early, and I know Will McDonald was the guy you really liked, and that's how I learned about him. I do wonder if he was a pretty good option for them. I think he was definitely on their radar. But if Will McDonald or Nolan Smith wasn't a big option for them, and I think Will McDonald was, 20 seemed to be a pivot point to me. And that's why I always looked at receiver. Rather than getting like the last of something, I always thought it made sense to get the best of something. So that's why I liked Zay Flowers and I liked Smith and Jigba, because I thought that was the opportunity. Or Michael Mayer was a guy I thought the team might be a little higher on. So I always thought that 20 pick, the way this specific draft fell, it was rather than just taking what's left for you, you go in a different direction. And I just think now what they've done is they've created, I think it's really important that so much people focus on filling weaknesses, and that's obviously is important, but building strengths is a really, really important thing. And it gets overlooked a lot. San Francisco's done a really, really good job at that. And now you look at their rooms, and coming out of the 2021 year where we spent so much time talking about the Russell Wilson trade, I don't know if you remember, Rob, but this roster was bleak, man. They didn't have a single tackle on their roster. Every year in free agency, they're getting a new pass rusher. They didn't have a third receiver. They didn't have a starting corner coming back. Both DJ Reed and I can't remember who else started that year, was a free agent. Now, all of a sudden, 2 years later, after these two drafts, they now have 4 offensive linemen on rookie contracts. They have a cornerback group with Tariq Woolen, Kobe Bryant, Devin Witherspoon, top 5 pick, 5 Michael Jackson's your 4th corner potentially now. And then there's still Trey Brown, who they took a couple of years ago. So that's a position. Wide receiver now with DK Lockett, JSN, and that's 3. And then the offensive line. So that's potentially 4. And then there's the running back room. So the running back room looks really, really good. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but that's now 5 areas. Sure, there's still areas they need to work on. Interior defensive line, all 3 linebackers are going the opposite way. All of them are going to be free agents after this year. So that's a room they're going to really need to fix. But you look big picture, that's now 4 or 5 areas where they have a top 3 room in the NFL. And that's something you could not say 2 years ago.
And actually, it's quite interesting when I was thinking about the defensive line, because I do want to have a conversation about the defensive line and what happens now, because it does still look a little bit light. But while you were talking there, it suddenly triggered in my mind. I was actually trying to think of what did the defensive line look like in 2013, because what you've just listed there, the great depth at cornerback, was a definite strength of that 20. Not that you try and copy 2013, but it was a definite strength of that team, that they had a lot of cornerbacks, a lot of depth there. You felt good about the linebacker position. I suspect that, with Bobby Wagner being back, a lot of people will feel that way now. They have veteran safeties. It's not Earl and Cam, but they've got veteran safeties. And when you look at the defensive line, there were only 4 listed defensive tackles on the roster in 2013. And they were Brandon Mebane, who was a good, not great player. Clinton McDonald, who was kind of like a situational pass rusher. Tony McDaniel, and Jordan Hill. Now, they had Red Bryant, but he was playing the Red Bryant position. He wasn't playing as a nose tackle. So when you actually think about it, Jeff, Brandon Mebane, Clinton McDonald, Tony McDaniel, and Jordan Hill versus Jaron Reed, Draymond Jones, Cameron Young, and maybe one more, and maybe that's Miles Adams, or maybe it is somebody that you can go and bring in. When you actually think about it, the difference isn't that stark. It's just whether or not they're playing a different scheme now that requires a bit more up front. Maybe it does. But in terms of just looking at what they had in 2013, I think you could even make a case that if you're going to start with Reed and another, and whether Jones, whether he plays outside and kicks inside, it might be more talented right now.
And that's the thing. And the thing that a lot of people lose themselves in is that they see what happened last year, and it's big. It's very easy to overreact because of how bad the defensive line group looked against the run last year. But they're going to ask guys to not have these high, all-encompassing roles. They're going to have a very specific role for someone like Cameron Young, who they just talked about how strong he is at the point of attack, and he can play a very similar role to some of those guys did. You mentioned 2013. He's not going to be asked you to come and blow up plays and be Michael Bennett. That's not him. And what I like about that pick too is I think him and Jaron Reed have very similar skill sets. And I think that's from like a roster building standpoint and like a roster mirroring standpoint. That's a guy where you can kind of have Jaron Reed as sort of a stopgap solution. And then you bump up Cameron Young in the next year after he gets a year under his belt. And that's a really good situation. So Al Woods is still out there. It's still an option. I think they're probably looking at him as a league minimum player at this point. He's 36 years old. He got hurt. It's still an option. They did get some undrafted free agents that are kind of built like nose tackles, and they have some kind of dart throws there where one of those guys could be the Clinton McDonald type, or they got Clinton McDonald for Kelly Jennings, if you remember, right before one of the seasons. So there's still an option to get guys like that at the bottom of the roster, defensive tackles. I think because of everyone thinks of the 3-4, they're used to seeing that giant nose tackle like the Steelers always had. And they saw Al Woods walk out the building, and people are a little freaked out because of that. But I don't think you need that to run the kind of defense they've run with the Fangio system. And Cam Young is going to get a lot of time in this defense. I think he was a priority player for them. And yeah, maybe I would have liked to see them add one more. But some of these undrafted free agents, I think there's some chances for them to be like come to play some of the small roles that Al Woods did. And I don't think it'll be a big difference.
It is going to be interesting to see what they do, because I'm looking on the cap space right now, and although they have $4.6 million in cap space, they have minus $4.7, nearly $4.8 million in effective cap space, because they've got to sign all these rookies. Now, a lot of those rookies won't sign for a while yet, so there's no pressure. They don't need to sign the rookies now. But at some point, Jeff, they're going to have to save $5 million, and there's not an obvious route to do that. There's contract extensions. I suspect that the decisions they've made at edge rusher will mean that they don't perhaps feel inclined to rush out and sign Uchenna and Wosu in a market that will favour him. You know, the Seahawks have very little leverage there. Whether or not somebody like a Quandre Diggs or a Jamal Adams would be feeling generous, I don't know. I don't know what they would do. Maybe someone like DK Metcalf, they can do something with him, but they're not a team that generally tries to create that space. But even without having to sign anybody else, they will need to save $5 million. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that. I wanted to go pick by pick. We've talked a bit about pick 20 there, and I agree with what you were saying about a pivot point. And I think if they truly believe that Jackson Smith-Njigba was the best receiver in the draft, and a lot of people did, a lot of people thought he was a top 15 player, a lot of people thought that he'd get a 13 to Green Bay, it makes complete justification. But I'm perhaps more in favor of the second day decisions than you are. So we can have a chat about that. But I first did want to start at 5. So a lot of the talk going in was Jalen Carter. All of the national mocks had Jalen Carter.
I fell for it the week of. I gotta admit.
You. I mean, I watched the video that you and Brian did, and you admitted, like, look, I've changed. I've been won round by it. And it was a very convincing argument, because when everybody, I can remember the night of the draft, my wife was just about to go to bed, and she says, well, what you thinking then? And I says, I don't, like, everybody's saying Jalen Carter. Like, everybody is saying it. It almost feels like, how can so many people be this wrong about this if it's not Jalen Carter? But what I wanted to ask is, because were you disappointed in the end? Because and a lot of fans, I got the impression that a lot of fans, and there was a huge, swath of people who wanted Jalen Carter, but the minute they didn't take him, I didn't see a lot of that. I didn't see any anger. I didn't see any sort of Seahawks Twitter explosion. Maybe that's just because I've unfollowed a lot of Seahawks Twitter, and I'm not in that crowd anymore. But I didn't sense a sort of a desperation. There was a bit of it, but not as much as I thought there might be, because it did feel like a very aggressive element of the fan base wanted Jalen Carter. And then what they perhaps feared happened was that he would stay on the board to the Eagles. The trendy team would take him in the NFC. And there we go. So, were you disappointed when they didn't take him? What was the immediate reaction? What was the sort of what going on in your mind?
No, I was not disappointed. Up until the last week, my opinion on Carter was pretty consistent. And my view was, if the team does enough to greenlight him, I can get excited about it. But I didn't have the information accessible, especially like knowing how that meeting went, to evaluate him. And he had more red flags than any player. You did the best job of anyone kind of highlighting that. So if they didn't deem him draftable, to me, it was always justifiable. I did get swayed, and I rarely do this, because I'm usually like, everything's a smokescreen. This year, more than anything, there was more bullshit out there than ever. And so I was not upset. I was excited by the concept, not going to lie. But when they took, I'll be honest, when they came on the clock, I was terrified of Tyree Wilson. That took over my entire thinking. I was kind of hoping that Houston stuff was real. And I had some very similar feelings about Tyree that you did by the end. And I was really nervous that just he didn't do it. He's potentially a really good prospect, but to come out with him as the primary guy in the draft. So my first thought when they took Witherspoon was, one, it was relief they didn't take Tyree Wilson. And two, I really liked Witherspoon as a player. I didn't think they pulled the trigger. And I found it really interesting. It even became really interesting when Detroit immediately traded down. To me, that was a total sign that they wanted Witherspoon. And then Albert Breer came out yesterday and said they actually been targeting him for months. So I think I would have had more emotion if Detroit just came out and drafted Jalen Carter. Because I think Detroit's in a similar situation as Seattle from like a roster standpoint. Like, still kind of need that quarterback, but they took a big step last year. They had 2 first-round picks. The fact that they traded out 2, that made me feel a little bit better than the Raiders passed, the Falcons passed. I think the Eagles were in a unique position. You've talked about that the whole time. The Eagles are just in a different spot. So, yeah, I did buy it, but I was not disappointed. I know there's some that were, but I think everyone realized the risk-reward of Jalen Carter, and the risk was massive. So the more you hear the team talk and the more you see them talk, I think you were right. I don't think he was even on their board. And I saw Davis Sue tweet out that Mike Holmgren was on the radio saying that their meeting with him didn't go particularly well. So hearing what like some of my favorite parts of the draft now is to figure out like what was real, kind of be like the detective and try to figure it out. And all indications are now he wasn't even on their board. So it's amazing how much of that came out. Peter King, you did a great job talking about Peter King kind of whiffed last year with the Kayvon Thibodeau stuff. And same thing a year later where he said basically the entire league thinks the Seahawks are taking Jalen Carter. So no, to answer your question, I understood it. I wasn't upset, but I'm more disappointed in myself that I fell for that thing the week of, and so did a lot of people.
Well, it was certainly with the Witherspoon thing. I'm probably very similar to you in that I really liked him as a player, but had taken a position. I remember right before the 2018 draft, I did a mock draft. I talked about running backs all the way through, and that my feeling was they were going to take a running back. They were going to take a running back early. They did. They took Rashad Penny. I wish they'd taken Nick Chubb instead, but they took Rashad Penny. And the week leading up to the draft, I'd kind of been knocked off that and ended up giving them. I can't remember the guy's name. He was a cornerback. He was long, very athletic. He'd been connected to Seattle tentatively at the top of round 2. And there was, a chance that they might have taken him. So I put that in the mock and changed it at the last minute, and I really regretted it. Really regretted that that I'd sort of changed from my position on running backs to go and do that. And then I said to myself, I'm never going to mock a cornerback to Seattle early until it actually happens. I have to see it to believe it. And even though you could easily watch the tape of Devon Witherspoon and go, I can well imagine Pete loving this, I needed to see them take a corner early to feel comfortable enough mocking it. I feel comfortable that I put Witherspoon at 6, so I was in the right ballpark, but wasn't convinced that they would actually pull the trigger there. But they did, and I'm glad that they did in hindsight. I think it's a really interesting pick. I think you just listen to the way that he speaks and the way that he communicates, and he seems like a cool guy. And I'm interested to see how he plays, Jeff. I think with Jalen Carter, I think we will come. I don't think we will ever see a player with more character flags, short of. No, actually, I'm going to stick with that. I don't think we'll ever see a player with more character flags. It wasn't just the numerous increasingly detailed reports that were coming out. And even stuff like the Bob McGinn scouting comments, like nobody at Georgia was sad to see him go. And then somebody else reported that, I can't remember who it was. It was Mike Florio or somebody right after the draft, that the coaches essentially were giving teams negative feedback on Carter. You've got the conditioning issue. You had the legal issue. I don't think we'll have a player who might have one of those issues to debate and discuss. But I'm not sure having the whole collection we'll ever see a player quite like that. And he may well go to Philadelphia, be supported by his former Georgia teammates and an experienced roster, and he might be fantastic. But I hope there's not going to be any second guessing, Jeff. Do you think there will be? Because I think that I think the best things happen for him. A small fall, which may humble him a little bit, but also the fact he's surrounded by people that it might be a good thing for his, very good character players that were at Georgia to be around. Plus, he's got Fletcher Cox. Plus, he's got Brandon Graham, who will keep him in tow. That's probably the best thing for Jalen Carter. And we have to acknowledge that if he'd have come to Seattle, he wouldn't have had any of that. He wouldn't have had the fall. He would have gone where the whole media was predicting him to go. And I don't think he'd have that chip on his shoulder either. So I think it's the best thing for him. But I also think it's the best thing for the Seahawks, the Raiders, the Falcons, the Lions, Jeff, that they... Maybe not the Lions, but maybe the other teams that have gone in a different direction. And I say maybe not the Lions because their first round was quite an adventure. Oh, you're on mute, Jeff.
My bad. That's a penalty. Seahawks fans will find a way to complain about anything. So the easiest thing to complain about is like draft hindsight. But I completely agree with you. It's such a unique situation where they have 4 of his Georgia teammates sitting right there, Jordan Davis and Jacoby Dean. And you're right. Like I heard Michael Lombardi talk about this, and I heard just like, you can't just mess around with Brandon Graham and Fletcher Cox in the locker room. And I know Jim Nagy went on Softy's show and said like Jaron Reed is going to be that guy for him. Nagy seemed to think they were going to take Carter, I think a couple days before the draft too. So I think there's a huge difference between Fletcher Cox, who's going to be a Hall of Fame player, Brandon Graham, who like won the Super Bowl for them with the strip sack, and then his buddies Jordan Davis and Jacoby Dean versus playing with Jones and Jaron Reed. Maybe Bobby Wagner's that guy to teach you to be a pro, but it's just such a different situation. Infrastructure really, really matters. And like Seattle had that crazy locker room in 2013, and they couldn't figure out how to work Percy Harvin in there. So you have to have the right kind of players. It's not just having veterans or having leaders. They are just uniquely built for Jalen Carter. And I think it was telling that it wasn't just Seattle that passed. It was Atlanta. It was Detroit. It was
Arizona.
Houston. All these teams that, and like I get the thing from Seattle, like, they had no bigger position of need than defensive tackle last year. And to see a guy with this much talent, but all those teams, the Bears passed. There were so many reports like if he makes it to 9, Jalen Carter's going to be the Bears. They traded down for basically nothing to take Darnell Wright. And so I think Philly was just uniquely positioned to build him, to draft him. And listen, obviously it will hurt if he comes out and he's just a total game wreck with no issues off the field. But I think the character evaluation has just become such an important deal. And you see the kind of guys the Seahawks brought in, and Witherspoon, the kind of guy he is. He's a culture changer kind of guy. The way he talks, the way he practices. I heard his coach Burt Balluma talk about just how he's the most active player at every practice, and that just screams Seahawks. Peak comparative to Troy Polamalu, which is like one of the more – that was an eye-opening comparison. I never thought about that. I saw more of like an Antoine Winfield kind of player who's a very exciting player on Buffalo and Minnesota and a really difference maker. And the whole time Witherspoon was like that Dan Campbell, like blue-collar kind of guy. He's got a really cool story where he was a basketball player, 0 stars. And just Jalen Carter is just the total opposite of that. So the fact that he doesn't seem to even be on their radar or be on their board, I don't think you could kind of criticize that evaluation. If they just chose one player versus another, then I think that's fair. But the fact that it seemed to be either Richardson, Will Anderson, or Witherspoon were their options, it seemed at that point, I think you have to look at those two guys, and they didn't get a chance for either of them. So it seemed like Witherspoon was always the guy that if those guys were gone, this was going to be where they were trending.
And I think it's a good pivot for us to go from talking about character with Jalen Carter to talking about Derek Hall. But I want to just flag that Kyle Anderson's dropped in a super chat. If you have a super chat, if you have a question you want to get out there or even a statement, super chat away and we will bring it up. Kyle, thank you for that. So Derek Hall, very much the opposite end of the scale in terms of character. Everybody knew going in that this was a legendary character player at Auburn that essentially kept things together, Jeff, when he was at Auburn. I actually wrote something immediately after the draft, and I've kind of shelved it for a bit. I might save it for another day this week about Derek Hall. And the player that the more I watched about him immediately after they drafted him in round 2, the more I kind of felt that a comparison for him that I think is not unfair is James Harrison at the Steelers. And the reason for that is because when James Harrison was drafted, he was only 240 pounds. He was 6 foot, so he was a smaller guy. I mean, he bounced around. He's not like Derek Hall. I think he was an undrafted free agent. He went to play in the European leagues or whatever, and then came back, I think. And then came together. It took him a couple of years working things out at Pittsburgh, and then he was like 16 sack, 18 sack player. And some of his weaknesses that I was reading about, because obviously I wasn't doing the blog then, some of the weaknesses of Harrison's game when he came out was, is he strong enough at the point? He's big, but is he absolutely locked down? Derek Hall is on his backside a bit too much for me when I watch tape. Can he vary his moves a little bit? He's perhaps not the most lightning. He's not a long, lean pass rusher. He's not a Will McDonald type. He's more of a thicker set guy. But Harrison managed to turn himself into one of the most effective players in the league. He had a lot of character issues that Derek Hall doesn't have. And I kind of feel that, Jeff, this is what Hall could potentially become. And I also think the good thing that I really like about it is, apart from the traits, because the traits are all there to work on, the arm length, the 1.55 10-yard split, the 4.20 short shuttle. These are what you want in a top pass rusher that you draft in the top 40. I think the thing for me is I just think games, those NFC West games, I am sick of seeing Fred Warner firing up the Niners before the game, going, "We hate them. We're going to come in here and beat them in their own back." And then I look at the Seahawks team, and it's soft. There's nobody like that. And when we were beating the Niners in 2012, 2013, there'd be Michael Robinson, there'd be Red Bryant, there'd be Marshawn, Cam, players that just went out there and scared the opponent and also commanded the authority of everybody else in that locker room. And it might not happen as a rookie, and it might not even happen 2 years in, but I've just got this sense that in 3 years' time, we'll see a little video of Derek Hall stood in the middle of a huddle, driving everybody crazy going into that game, getting everybody revved up, and then he goes out there and just lights it up for 4 quarters. He may never be an elite speed, twitch pass rusher like the Tops, the Garretts, the Bosas, and people like that. But I've just got a sense that he could be a glue guy in the locker room, Jeff, and that for at least the length of this rookie deal, you're going to get a ton of stuff out of him, a lot of snaps, a lot of effort, and he will make some plays. Might not be a game record, but I think he's going to be a really useful pick for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I see a lot of there. I wonder just with him whether he was sort of their backup to Will Anderson. And Will Anderson was a guy that I know that they would not have moved in. I heard there was a lot of excitement when CJ Stroud went in 2 because they thought Will Anderson was going to make it to them. And you look at like their skill sets and what they do, and obviously Will Anderson was a much more productive player. He was a top 3 pick for a reason, but a lot of what they do in terms of like they're not these freakish, crazy athletes. But if you watch Seattle play, like they were so bad at setting the edge last year, they had to bring Bruce Irvin off the street to do it, and Darrell Taylor couldn't do it. And really, he's become sort of that one-trick pony defensive designated pass rusher. And they needed a guy on the edge who could play with. I know it's the worst play on words, but they needed a guy to play with an edge. And they were a little soft at that spot. Darrell Taylor was so bad at the early down stuff. They had to bench him. And he was the guy who was supposed to be like the heart and soul of their defense. And yeah, really, if you watch this defense last year, they just didn't have a lot of fiery leaders, a lot of fiery players. And Bobby is a great leader, a veteran guy that everyone respects, but he's not that fiery guy that kind of changes the attitude of your team. Quandre Diggs, he's more of a quiet, like Joker. He's a veteran guy that everyone really respects. Jamal is kind of the big talker, but Jamal's never on the field anymore, so you can't really call him that guy. And Draymond Jones.
I think Jamal's fired up for Jamal.
Exactly, yeah. He comes out with like his Gucci sunglasses, and I don't think Jamal's a guy. So you don't really have a lot of those guys. And it's been one. If you watch the defense play, they were kind of just soft last year. They didn't have that leadership, those fire, and to add Witherspoon and Hall in that defense, that changes a lot. I was a little surprised by the pick because I didn't spend a lot of time on him. I spent a lot of time on like a different group of edge rushers. I thought that there were other positions that fit that slot. So I was a little taken back by the pick, but the more you look at it, it really fits in terms of like what they need just from a roster standpoint and what they need from just like a character standpoint. The character of their team was pretty soft in that front 7 last year. Everyone talked about it all year. This front 7 needs work. Boye Mafe seems like a bit of a quieter guy. He's a guy that flashed a bit at the end of the year. Darrell Taylor is just the way he plays, he just can't be that kind of guy. He seems a little crazy coming off the edge, but he can be just filled into his role now. And Nwosu's a guy that seemed to talk a bit. He brought some of the edge, and I heard Pete talk about it. They love one of the reasons they drafted him is they fell in love with Nwosu and kind of the attitude he brought, and they wanted 2 of them. And I can see exactly what you're talking about. Tariq Woolen seems like a quieter, more low-key guy. He's not that fiery guy that they had, and they wanted to make their practices famous where they had all these guys that were coming off the edge. And just see Hall's reaction when he got drafted. That doesn't seem like a calm by nature, quiet guy. Like he's yelling, he's fired up. You combine that with the athletic traits he has, and I kind of see it as like the Will Anderson light kind of pick. Like they have a very similar skill set, how they win, how they're good they are against the run. I can see why they drifted towards that, because once they didn't get him and even Will McDonald, who's a bit of a different player, getting that next group of edge rusher, a lot of people thought maybe Ojulari from LSU, but Ojulari is not the kind of guy we're talking about. He doesn't have that presence. He's more of a speed rusher that can win differently. And I think the Seahawks really prioritized kind of adding toughness to their entire team, because they were not a tough team last year. They scored a lot of points. They got better. They weren't a physical team, though. When they play physical teams, you saw a Tampa game, you saw that Atlanta game, you saw the Raiders game. They were not physical on defense and really not physical on offense. And Hall just screams physical edge player. And he's got the traits where he has some upside. So he was off my radar. That pick really caught me off guard. And I was still trying to figure it out. But once the class came together, I really understand it a little more.
And I think so. On my horizontal, not that my horizontal ball means anything, but I had Will Anderson as a legit first rounder. I had Will McDonald as a player I would take in the round 1 this year, and then I had Derek Hall at the top of the round 2 list. And I think generally they caught it quite well because they had, obviously Hall was the first defensive end / pass rusher, whatever, outside linebacker at 37. But then you had Isaiah Foskey going 3 picks later. Then you had Ojulari, the next pick after that. You had Keon White and Tuipulotu went very shortly after. It did sort of trigger a bit of a run there on pass rushers. And I've seen people saying, look, they could have got Derek Hall later and maybe they could have done, but I suspect given the way that the teams took pass rushers off the board, probably not. And I think you're right. I think they were determined to get one. And that doesn't mean that they reached for a need because I had him in the top 45.
Yeah.
I think it was a fit where need met quality. Got a couple of super chats, and there's a question about the quarterback situation, which I wanted to talk to Jeff about. So I'll save that for a minute. I just want to quickly talk about Zach Charbonnet. I'm completely comfortable with the pick, Jeff. I've been talking about Zach Charbonnet for 2 years because I thought he was going to be coming out last year's draft and thought he could be essentially what Ken Walker was, that essentially they would draft him to be the RB1 a year ago. I totally understand why people look at that and think that's a luxury. Didn't need that. Did need defensive linemen, but I think actually when you actually look at the defensive linemen who are available in that spot, yeah, they could have took Zach Pickens. There's nobody who really sort of jumps out and goes, that's a game-changing defensive lineman. That's going to solve all the problems. That's that. Not that Zach Charbonnet is going to solve all sorts of problems either, but for the next 4 years, the Seahawks have got 2 really talented running backs who are their style. And I just think Seattle's offense, Jeff, is set up to possibly be the most explosive it's ever been in franchise history now. The weapons that they've got, and it could all be effed up, for want of a better way of putting it, if Ken Walker pulled a hamstring in preseason. Because if you're then trotting out DJ Dallas or Kenny McIntosh or somebody like this or some random 4th rounder that they picked up, I think it could undermine everything because of the style that they play. So is a 2nd-round pick necessary to avoid that? Not every year, but Zach Charbonnet is perfect for them. If Walker goes down, they've got Charbonnet. If Charbonnet goes down, they've got Walker. They can use them both to make sure that neither of them goes down. And if you've got those 2 and those 3 receivers and those tight ends and those 2 bookend tackles, Jeff, and if Geno Smith can be more like the first half of the season than the second half of the season, then you've got a chance to be a really fantastic offense. And that's why I like the pick.
Yeah, I was a little thrown by the pick, but I was conflicted. I love the player. And Brian Nemhauser, who does our other show, he put out a tweet, me and him talking when we were doing those scenarios where I talked in mid-March about how Charbonnet was the perfect complement to Ken Walker. And I think in that scenario, I got him with the 3rd-round pick, probably not as realistic as we got closer to the draft. So I love the player. I think he if you watch Ken Walker, there are some things he did really, really well. He was explosive. He got a little better at hitting the hole in the second half of the year. And the things that he didn't well, which was like the short yardage stuff, 3rd and 1. There was like even the end of the game against the Rams where they had that 1st and 1 from the goal line and they couldn't split a yard and they had to kick a field goal. I think some of the stuff that Charbonnet does complements him to a T. Is perfect. He can play on 3rd downs. He could pass block, which was one of the weaknesses of Walker coming out of school. They had a big need at running back losing Rashad Penny. I think they really thought Rashad Penny was going to re-sign, and he went elsewhere. And there are some guys I like round 4. Roschon Johnson from Texas was the guy, but he went earlier in the day 3 that I would have guessed, so they wouldn't have had a chance to draft him. So I did think RB2 was a bigger need, especially not getting Homer back. I thought they needed to add 2 running backs at some point. So the reason I was upset, I guess, was not because of him. It was because I was so convinced of that John Michael Schmitz thing. I know Tony Pauline said if he got to 37, the team was going to have a party. And then he's sitting there at 52, and I'm like, okay, they're going to take him now. And for years, I've been joking, like, okay, like I got to stop getting convinced by these reports about centers. And I bought that one. And they passed Schmitz again, and I was crushed at the time because of that. I thought they whiffed not getting a center. But the fact that they were able to get the center, who I thought they could have taken in the third round on day 3, it could completely change my perception of the pick because I really do like the player. I know it's not ideal to take running backs in the second round, and I know ideally maybe they could have taken Schmitz there, but I don't think the team saw Schmitz the same way that's maybe that report indicated, where they're taking more of the kind of players, and maybe they said, if we can get this guy, if we can get Whippler or this guy in round 5, why are we spending a round 2 pick on it? And I understand that thinking, and I thought it was bold at the time. I thought it was devastating they didn't take a center with one of those 2 picks. So initially, I was pretty crushed. But again, I can't be mad at Charbonnet. I literally had handpicked him a month before as what I called the perfect complement. And now, like you said, they have the most talent on offense by a large margin of any Seahawks team I've ever seen. The 3 receivers, the 3 tight ends, and the 2 running backs, and then added Kenny McIntosh and DJ Dallas, who was competent at times last year. They have so much roster talent in terms of skill position. Nothing like a Pete Carroll team, nothing like they've had before. Russell Wilson must be wondering, like, what the hell is going to leave? But they got the running back room. Like I said before, it's got to be a potential to be a top 3, top 5 room in the league. And I know people are getting upset by that and analytics and all that, but that's what you want to build when you're building rosters. You want positions of strength. And I think Charbonnet just complements him so well. And if Walker gets hurt, you're not throwing out Tony Jones or some of the guys they had to start last year. They got a guy who could be an RB1 for a lot of teams. So you want to have those guys pushing each other. You want to have those guys. He's not going to eat into his playing time. I think they're going to complement each other really well. And the way this team wants to play and the way to probably maximize Geno is you need guys like that. So, and then for next year, if you want to drop a quarterback into this offense, my God, they have a lot going on.
I was also convinced that they would take a center in round 2. Was completely convinced. Well, I'm somewhat surprised that they didn't. But I think it's interesting because, I mean, the report that Tony put out, I mean, he said that Steve Hutchinson had worked them both out, and it makes you think, well, that's a different, that's beyond just, there's a bit of chatter that the league thinks that they are going to take it. My dog's having a nightmare in the background, barking at somebody in their sleep, by the way. So if you can hear that in the background, that's what it is. That suggested a degree of interest that went beyond this team thinks they're going to take a center. So I was convinced they were going to take one. Was surprised that they didn't. I don't know, Joe. It's hard to. So when I watched Schmitz at the Senior Bowl, a lot of my Senior Bowl notes on Schmitz, I should have probably just. It's such a long period between the end of January and April. I think sometimes you do get persuaded by arguments. You do listen to people you trust. Jim Nagy was incredibly high on Schmitz, saying he's like a first-round player and all of this. And you can be influenced by people that you respect and trust. And even when they're wrong, you're probably right to listen to them for the most part. But my notes on Schmitz were that I thought he had as many good reps as he had bad reps at the Senior Bowl, that he struggled with his angles. That's, front on, he could get his hands in the right place, and that was it. He would lock on and win. But any kind of attempted pass rush from the side, his footwork was quite lumbering to get across and seal that off. And I could imagine that being a bit of an issue, particularly against Aaron Donald. So I think that I'm very comfortable with what they did. And the fact that they've got a center who anybody who watched Michigan said last year was, this center looks really solid. And maybe if he can be really solid at the next level, he might never be Creed Humphrey All Pro, but he might just be someone who we never talk about. And if that's the case, he's doing his job. So comfortable with that. So we had this super chat here, and I'm a bit behind on the super chats, but this one from Taker610 says, what are the chances Locke could be a long-term starter at quarterback? So appreciate the super chat, and I want to sort of broaden this out beyond Drew Lock. What do you think about the quarterback position? Because they obviously haven't drafted anybody, and I thought it was interesting that So Detroit drafted somebody. Detroit drafted Hendon Hooker. The Rams drafted somebody. The Raiders drafted somebody. The Saints drafted somebody. The Vikings drafted somebody. All of the teams who have quarterbacks who you would perhaps suggest are in a similar boat to Geno Smith, similar age, similar sort of profile, similar, could be an option for a few more years, but we don't really know. They all took a quarterback at some point. But the Seahawks didn't, Jeff. And yet Smith's on this contract, which is $31.2 million for next year, and it could easily hit some of those incentives. For example, Geno Smith could play like crap, and the defense could play better, and the running game could play well, and they hit 9 wins. That's $2 million. He could throw as many interceptions. What was it, 30 or something like last year? He could throw 30 interceptions. He could throw 25 interceptions, but he still gets $2 million more. So that could happen. You know, he could throw a lot more interceptions and still get the $2 million. So then it's not 31.2. It ends up being like 35, 36, 37, 38. And then you've got a choice to make. Is he worth that? And it's not a case of, is he good or bad? Yes or no. It's a case of, he could be good, but is he good enough for $40 million? So there's a big decision to be made there. Drew Lock's on a 1-year contract. They don't have anybody beyond that. How would you assess that situation? Maybe Schneider's comfort level with that? Because they're not going to panic for this year because they clearly trust Geno and like Drew Lock. But they don't know what's going to happen. And it's not a totally ridiculous scenario that in a year's time, they're sat there with no contracted quarterback going into the offseason again. There's less desire to re-sign Geno Smith. Drew Lock won't have played if Geno Smith plays a full season, so we won't know anything about him. And then all of a sudden, all this good work that's been done to build up the roster could be undone by a quarterback situation that is similar to the Colts, going year to year on veteran players, trying to find any old answer every year. Or they end up forcing themselves into some really aggressive trade up in the draft, which could just land you with a Trey Lance, could land you with a Patrick Mahomes, but it could land you with a Trey Lance. So how do you feel about the fact they don't seem to have anything beyond this year as a long-term guaranteed? At least we have that plan.
Yeah, it's not ideal. It's not ideal. You saw John even talking about it. I mean, you talked about it off the air. John seemed a little hurt that they weren't able to find a quarterback. The 5th round, 3 guys went right before they were supposed to draft. I wonder if Dorian Thompson-Robinson was a guy they were going to take DTR, but I don't see that guy as a long-term. He's probably projects as more of a backup. So Anthony Richardson's the guy they obviously thought was in consideration. I heard there was some hesitation in the organization today that some people were unsure whether they could spend that pick and spend that money on a quarterback they weren't sure it's going to play for 2 years. But I think John realizes it. And I thought the key thing when he talked about that they prioritized 2024 draft capital in all their trade down talks. And I think that's one of the reasons everyone's like, why didn't they trade down? I think they were really looking for 2024 stock because I think they realized that the way the draft shook out, I had heard they weren't high on Will Levis. I'd heard some of the stuff with him didn't go well. And they had a chance to take him at 5, they had a chance to take him at 20. They could easily take him at 20. That would have been pretty good value. But they must have not. The stuff I heard must have been true. So that didn't seem to be on their radar. And I think once you heard them, John, talk that 2024 stock was a priority, I think that signals that they know they're going to have to move up next year. And I think next year's class, which everyone hates when you talk about next year's class, but there's a guy who plays at Washington, Michael Penix, who's going to be picked probably not in the top 2. The top 2 guys are probably going to go in the top 5 regardless. So they're going to spend a lot of time on quarterbacks. And I think it's a scenario like you talked about, Rob. I think they're going to have to make a move up. And it's not ideal. The one thing that's working in their favor is they don't have a lot of roster needs. And they have a lot of young players that the Russell Wilson trade has given the luxury of where they don't need like 6 new rookies next year. Obviously, you're going to hope they are, but they're probably going to be picking somewhere from 18 to 25, most likely, even say 16 to 25. Their situation's a lot like the Chiefs Mahomes thing, and that's what we talked about doing this year. But I think Alex Smith is a little further along than where Geno is at this point. If Geno plays like last year in the first half, then great. But I think Geno, as good as he is, will still have some sort of ceiling that's going to limit you from being a Super Bowl team. I don't think Geno's probably that guy. So I think the Seahawks are probably going to have to do what the Chiefs did, and they're going to have to make a move. And they're lucky that the Russell Wilson package of picks, these 6 picks they got really for him, or the 4 picks they got for him, that gives them a luxury where they're going to have to probably move up next year, because I don't think Drew Lock is that guy. I think Drew Lock's a project dart throw, as much as that 5th-round pick would have been. Drew Lock's the kind of guy the scouts love every year. He's got tools. He's got that big arm. He's got everything. But whenever we've seen him play, even that preseason game, he couldn't identify that blitz off the edge that he fumbled and lost the game. So I would hope that I know some of the Schneider guys love Drew Lock, but I don't think they view him as a franchise guy. I think they view him as a developmental player. But I think they're going to have to move up for a quarterback next year. And unless Geno plays like the way that you can just count on him for the next couple of years, he's still 33 years old and going to be 33 next year. I think they're going to have to move up. I think they getting that 3rd rounder was a really, really good start. If Denver flakes out again this year, that's going to be a high 3rd rounder, and then they're going to have to use that to move, I think. I think they're going to end up moving up in the 1st round for a quarterback next year. I think it's going to shock a lot of people, but they painted themselves into this corner, and you hope it's not Trey Lance. You hope you don't make that mistake, but I don't really see what other option they have at this point. They're going to spend a lot of time, just like they did this year, on the road with quarterbacks.
Yeah, well, I've started watching them. When I thought it was quite pointed that when Schneider, and I just think it's a difficult press conference to do immediately after a draft, because it's quite hard to hide your emotions. Before a draft, you can go out there and play poker. I think after a draft, especially when you're talking for 25 minutes, like they often do after every round, it's something will pop out of your mouth. And when he was talking about, and we just suddenly decided we needed stock for next year, I'm thinking, well, why? Like you don't need stock for next year, because you're never planning to trade up for a linebacker, are you? You're never planning to trade. And then you've drafted a load of pass rushes. You've got your bookend tackles. You've got cornerbacks galore. There's only one position left. Like there's only one. But the only reason you feel you need stock for next year is for quarterbacks. And it was so bloody obvious. He might as well just put a sign up behind him saying, we are in the quarterback market for next year. Now, I'm interested to see how this all plays out, because I've started watching some of these players, and let me just say it's a deeper class, but I don't think there's any. You don't watch them and go, "Wow, we're talking different level players now." I mean, you could watch Bryce Young and Stroud and Levis from 2021 and go, "Okay, there's some flaws, but there's a lot to like." And with this, and it's no different with your Drake Mays and your Quinn Ewers. I mean, the first game I watched of Quinn Ewers, Jeff, I was calling him Quinn Ewers, because there's a lot of that to him. And then you watch other stuff and you think, well, okay, that's really good, but that's really bad. And with Drake May, you think, yeah, I like that, but I also hate that miss. And and then there's a lot of other sort of in between players. Like, I liked Tyler Van Dyke going into last year. Mario Cristobal managed to destroy him. I've been talking about Spencer Rattler on the blog in the last 24 hours, because he actually ended the season looking like Spencer Rattler was supposed to look when everyone was talking about him as the number 1 overall pick. And you think, could he take a step forward? Maybe. I think they're going to love the arm of Michael Penix Jr. I think that that arm is so good that I can see. I mean, his technique's all over the place, and he plays in that system. And he had 8 interceptions in a system that Hendon Hooker's had 5 interceptions in 2 years. But I can imagine the Seahawks. But the only reason he's saying they need stock is because they're planning on trading up next year, or they feel like they might have to trade up to get a quarterback, and that maybe the depth at quarterback will work to them. And although I don't anticipate them moving up for Caleb Williams or somebody like that, I think they want the option to move up for probably that second tier of guys. And did you notice, Jeff, that he already name dropped Quinn Ewers in one of his other press conferences?
I did.
When he was talking about Jackson Smith and Jigba. So it kind of felt to me like, I don't know. Is this too much of a reach to think that as John was sat there, having spent 2 first-round picks, neither on a quarterback, having sat there with, I've got 3 first-round picks and 4 second-round picks in the next 2 drafts, and when they did the Wilson trade, and he'll have been thinking, which quarterback can I get? Who am I going to replace Russell with? And then to come out of it all with nothing. I think he may well have been sat there, having not disappointed with the picks he's made by any stretch, but sat there already thinking, oh, I like Quinn Ewers, like we've got to find a way to get him next year, or something like that. And then he comes out in the press conference and goes, and Jackson Smith, Jimmy Ryan, and Quinn Ewers said that as well, not just CJ Stroud. It's like Quinn Ewers was there for like 5 minutes. He never played a game for Ohio State. Who gives a crap what Quinn Ewers thinks about Jackson Smith and Jigba? But you brought him up. So it kind of makes me think, is there something there where he's already thinking about this? There was one other thing I noticed today, Jeff, which I wanted to just mention. And I don't think it's really that relevant. But Jordan Love signed a new contract today, right? 2020 draft. And I'd forgotten about this. And I don't know why I remembered it today once I saw him sign his contract. I don't know if you remember what happened in 2020. But the Seahawks were picking 27th overall. And the Green Bay Packers traded up 3 spots to get Jordan Love. 3 spots to 26th. They jumped the Seahawks to take Jordan Love. The other teams they jumped were the Tennessee Titans, who I think I'm right in saying had just got to the AFC Championship game and had just paid Ryan Tannehill his big contract extension. And the Ravens, who had Lamar Jackson. So why on earth, unless somebody else was talking to Miami about moving into that spot, and they may well have been, I just wonder whether or not, what's his name, Gutekunst, the GM in Green Bay, thought, I know that that relationship with Russell is going a bit south. We know that they were prepared to take Mahomes. I'm not going to risk the Seahawks taking Jordan Love. We're going to get above them and trade up 3 spots to take him here. And I'm not for a second suggesting the Seahawks would have taken Jordan Love. I don't think they would have done. I think that might have, if Green Bay did have that plan, Jeff, they may have been overthinking it. But I did just find it interesting. It reminded me that the Packers essentially traded above the Seahawks to get Jordan Love because they're the only team. There's no way the Titans and the Ravens were in the quarterback market. As we now know, the Wilson relationship with Seattle was going south already at that point. And I just wondered whether or not the Packers were thinking, we need to jump that team just to be safe.
Oh, yeah. And those guys know John Schneider in Green Bay and exactly how he thinks. And the way we were trained in Green Bay was Ron Wolf was, you should take a quarterback every year. And that's Ron Wolf's the guy who pulled John Schneider off the street. He wrote him all these letters, and that's how he got into the NFL business. And if you looked at like the early stages of John Schneider's time in Green Bay, they had Brett Favre and they drafted Mark Brunell and Aaron Brooks and all these guys, Matt Hasselbeck. They ended up trading them all away. And I remember when Schneider got here, that was something he talked about a lot. He said, that's what we're going to do. And they drafted 2 quarterbacks in 14 years. And I think it eats it up. I think he's stubborn to a fault. He stuck so much to his board. And the quarterback thing just hasn't worked out. So I think you're right. I think they're probably thinking in Green Bay in a draft that was kind of receiver heavy and Schneider hadn't taken a lot of receivers high. I think they had to be wondering at the time. That was coming off the Packers Green Bay. The Packers played Seattle in the playoffs and they saw how they lost that playoff game. They had to be wondering, maybe possible Jordan Love. I don't think Seattle would have taken Jordan Love at that time. I think the next year is where things really, really broke down with the Seahawks once they started the whole let Russ cook thing and then everything fell off it halfway through the season. That's where the relationship really ended. But coming out of that year, I think that relationship was actually pretty good, where they actually did let Russ kind of take over the offense. And it's interesting, though. You always will wonder if they – and now Anthony Richardson goes 1 pick right before them. And Jim Irsay comes out and says they've known they're going to take him for a month. So Seattle probably spends all this time probably thinking maybe we're getting this guy. And they had no shot at him unless they traded up. So Schneider just can't catch a break on this quarterback thing. Cleveland wouldn't even take the Russell Wilson for Josh Allen number 1 at the time. So it's going to be another year searching for him. And if you're a GM like him, quarterback is always on your mind. And yeah, they probably thinking 2 years ago, okay, we got all the stock. We need to get any quarterback we want. And if you would have told them last year Geno and Drew Lock would be all they have a year later, there's no way they would have believed you. So I had to imagine at some point they thought Richardson, and going into this year and a lot of this year, I thought Will Levis would be the guy that John would fall for. He had all the characteristics of Josh Allen that hit. And a lot of things happened this year that fell off a cliff. And a lot of it I heard had to do with his kind of a personality, not his playing style. And what I understand, they didn't like his personality. And that was a bit of a shocker to me. I thought they would really like him as a prospect. So it's another year where they don't have the stock anymore other than that third rounder. So it's going to be harder to find a quarterback. And remember, when Kansas City moved up, it was like 27-10. So they had to give up a ton. And it's something that Seattle's going to have to spend all year because they don't have a ton of organizational needs, which is pretty cool. They need to get better in the defensive line. They need to get better on – they're probably going to need some new players next year, but they don't have a lot of guys they're going to have to sign. They're going to need linebackers. But outside of that, they have so many young players. It gives you so much cap flexibility. And then the Jamal Adams contract is going to come off soon too. They are in a really good position where they're going to be able to move, but it's much easier said than done. And if you're sitting at 24 or whatever, or 23, that's a long way to go to get a quarterback. So they're going to have to be studying a lot of guys. Their scouts are not going to have a nice, easy year. They're going to have to spend a lot of time on those guys. And if Geno Smith kind of goes back to what he was in the second half of last year or what he was before that, they don't want to become the next version of the Tennessee Titans who have to trade up for another quarterback again. So they've gone from that. They've gone from AFC Championship to quarterback purgatory, and I'm sure John is terrified of that happening to him.
Yeah, and just to clarify a couple of things, I definitely don't think they would have taken Jordan Love. I think afterwards they were speaking almost like they'd seen the three linebackers. Was it Queen, Murray, and Brooks?
Yeah,
and had decided they wanted to take their favorite of who was left. I think they made that clear after the draft. But I just wonder whether the Packers spooked themselves into something there. And then I agree with everything you've said about next year. I think if they were planning a big move, Jeff, up to, I think they probably would have tried to trade down from 5, whatever, and got like a more, even if it was just a second round pick next year or something. I think they would have done a bigger jump. I just get the feeling that they think there's like a group. Like maybe there's a thicker, like there might be players available in the teens, and that maybe whether it is Ewers, Penix, somebody like that they think, yeah, do you know what? We might have to move up X number of spots, but not into the top 5. So therefore, it might be less expensive, and therefore perhaps that was why that trade in particular worked. But we're so far away, and the thing I find so interesting about scouting quarterbacks, Jeff, is that it is quite frustrating because when you watch a defensive lineman do something great, if the next snap's not that amazing, you just fast forward to the next snap and you look for the next great snap, and you can build a portfolio of great snaps for a defensive lineman and go, this is why they should be a top 10 pick. But when you watch a quarterback, if they do something great and then do something really stupid on the next play or on the next series, it sticks in your brain. You have to balance out the pros and cons with a quarterback more than any other position. Like you can overlook rough snaps from any other position. A cornerback could get beat, Jeff, and you will go, well, okay, but what did you do here? But with a quarterback, if they miss a throw or they miss a read or their processing is not very good or their footwork's crap, it sticks in your mind like crazy, and it does stick in teams' minds. And you're constantly looking for almost perfection, or at least perfect traits, to suggest that perfection is possible. And those players are so rare.
Yeah, and that's the toughest position to scout in the league. It's something that drives it, and that's why Chris Ballard, who's considered one of the best talent evaluators, had basically gone to the firing block. And he's a guy that, like, you interviewed GMs 2 years ago. People thought, okay, this guy is the best general manager in the league. The Colts, they have this ascending team, and Andrew Luck retires. And they spend the next 5 years trying to find guys. And they go through cycles of quarterbacks, and the Anthony Rich thing happens. But that's what drives these GMs crazy. And you're trying to find that guy that can do everything you just talked about. And it's such a challenging evaluation. It's such a difference in style. And so many quarterbacks just whiff. There was that draft a few years ago with Sam Darnold and Baker and all these. It's tricky. They're going to have to find different kinds of quarterbacks. Spencer Rattler's an interesting one you mentioned. He's a guy that came in really hyped. He was supposed to be like a top 3 pick coming into this draft year, and then he transferred schools and panics in the left-handed against a guy where I haven't seen a lot of left-handed quarterbacks hit this league. So Quinn Ewers is a guy that was a big prospect coming in. He's now at Texas where they have Arch Manning, and it's tricky because everyone knows those top two guys. It's finding that next guy and getting comfortable with them because there are teams that wouldn't have drafted Richardson, and it's so tricky.
Do you know what just a quick one, I want to run through the super chats. I've got one last question for you. The thing with Ewers is, and I put this on the blog, I found an article where all of the big name quarterbacks in college football, I think Bryce Young was there and some others, and they all came together for a showcase, and they were all talking about how Ewers was the alpha. Like Ewers was the one who turned up and was like the main man, who was dead. Everyone else was having fun. He was dead serious the whole time. And it did sort of make me think, I can see why John likes this. I can also see John really falling for the haircut he had last year, which is now gone. He's cut his hair because he was worried that he was being poorly characterized as a bit of a bit of a joker or something like that, or so he's cut the hair. He looks a lot different now. He's got this whip-like release, Jeff, which is just incredible. I don't think I've ever seen a release as good as his. Like it just comes out. He needs nothing. There's no time, no waste of motion. It just flicks out, and he generates so much force with it. But the problem is, Jeff, is you don't often know where it's going to go. And the other positive I would say is that the Steve Sarkisian offense is a lot more complex than some of these other offenses. So he is actually having to process a proper offense, and that's why I can imagine it going well for him. But he's a bit like Richardson. He's played a handful of games in his first year, and now he's going into his second year, and he needs to play a full season of football. And even then, he'll be inexperienced, even if he plays every game for Texas next year. And there's going to be that specter of Arch Manning in the background throughout the whole time. That if it doesn't go well, what are the Texas fans going to be saying? Put Arch Manning in. So but I think he is an interesting player.
Quick thing, they're gonna have good intel on that guy. Steve Sarkisian worked for Pete for how many years?
Yeah.
So
they'll know all about they'll know all about Quinn Ewers. I mean, in fairness, if Quinn Ewers actually does very well this year with all of that Arch Manning stuff going on, it'll be a real feather in his cap because it will show that he can deal with all of that pressure. Quick super chats before last question for Jeff. Rob, with the viewership growing on STB, would love to see a true message board so we can all interact, even when you don't post articles. Check out HF boards for inspiration. Thanks, Matt. If there's interest in that, I'm happy to look into it. If people want to send me an email, if that's something that they would like to see, then I'm definitely happy to have a look and see if that's something we could introduce to the blog. There's a couple more. Let me just find them. Garth says, Rob's dog is seeing the future without a competent centre when he was having a little nightmare earlier. Hoping for the best. Yes. I think we all are. This from Greg. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for the incredible draft coverage again this year, Rob. Do you have any favourites from the undrafted free agents that signed in Seattle? And do you think any have the best chance to make the team? Greg, my answer to that is purely because I've watched him more than the others, is Bobo, the receiver. I thought there's something about him that I quite like. I think he's got a shot to make it. He's just very consistent. I even think he might be able to bulk up a little bit and play a bit of move tight end. But I think he's a good player. Jeff, I don't know if you've watched any of the undrafted free agents. Is there any name that stood out for you? But thank you, Greg, for the super chat.
Bobo's a guy that I actually thought was pretty interesting. I think some of the deep tackles it's a spot you can find free agents like Robert Cooper from Florida State. I think has a chance to. It's a good dice roll there. And there's a guy I think from San Diego. What's his name? San Diego State. Jonah Tavai was a guy that's kind of studying as a potential interior defensive lineman late in the draft, and they ended up getting both those guys. I think one of those guys has a chance. It's just the numbers aren't there at D tackle, and the Seahawks have done a really good job up prior to last year just finding defensive tackles on the cheap. And Al Woods, everyone talks about Al Woods like he's just like godlike figure, and he's been great, but they got him as like a minimum street free agent. They got Tony McDaniel and Tyba Rubin and all these guys. So I'm always keeping my eye. Poona Ford was a guy. Everyone now went crazy today. They didn't sign Poona Ford. He was a UDFA as well. So it's a position where you can kind of find players to fill very specific roles. So I'm watching Tavai from San Diego State and Robert Cooper from Florida State as guys who I think could hit.
And another one from Garth says, I was shocked Indy took Anthony Richardson, way too smart to move. for that organization. Well, I thought they had a good draft overall.
I thought they had a great draft.
Some good players. I mean, they're an interesting team. They're going to be an interesting team to watch. It's going to be fascinating. Whether Richardson succeeds or fails, it's going to be fascinating to watch. So the final question, Jeff, is what do you think happens next? Because Pete has already spoken of their desire to get stuff done. I kind of assume that Poona Ford would come back to be that last man. That's not happening now. He's gone to Buffalo. Is Al Woods going to come back? There seems to be nothing on Shelby Harris at all. I had a look at the list of other defensive tackles who are out there, and it's a pretty crap list. Frankly, there's nobody, unless they go and get a really old player like a Sue or somebody. Everybody else is just a 30-year-old coming to the end, not really had much of a career type, Jeff. What do you think they will do next? And it could even be a cap casualty move or a cap create some room move.
They're going to need to add bodies at defensive tackle. Defensive line still needs bodies. They brought in Cameron Young. They talked about the free agents. Mike Morris was a good pickup, but they still need spots and they need guys who can play. So they're right now, the way it's set up, Cam Young and Mike Morris are going to have to play like 500 snaps each this year. And it's a lot to ask of day 3 rookies. And you're right. Shelby Harris is a guy, like I thought he would be like, someone would pick him up as like a low level free agent. There's been nothing on him since he got cut. I didn't think he was terrible last year. I thought he was okay. I thought he wasn't worth $12 million, but I thought he added some juice in the defensive line. And I think you put in with some better players. You want him as a complimentary guy. So they're going to have to create some money around. So I don't know what they do there because we've kind of gone through all the levers. We thought Jamal Adams or Quandre's contract would be altered. I don't know if they still do something there. And those are the 2 contracts that just stick out in their cap table. Everything else kind of makes sense. So I don't know if they like injury settle Brian Monet because he might miss half the year. I don't know if he can do something there. But something like Harris, something like Woods, I think they're both on the radar because, I look like you. Like some people want Jadeveon Clowney. I don't think he fits what they want to do on defense at all. And it's kind of amazing. We spent a couple of summers ago, everyone was like a Jadeveon Clowney watch. And now 3-4 years later, he's been on 3 teams and he's basically like out of the league. So it's amazing how little foresight some people have. And even the Seahawks, their whole plan was built around Jadeveon Clowney 3 years ago. And which is why there's finally they're starting to start a sustainably built group. But they still need a couple bodies in there. They still are way short of the 90-man roster. And all area just points to interior defensive line because the rest of their team is filled out relatively well. They need to add a couple quarterbacks, but relatively not much to do other than that.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe this is something nearer for cut down day, but I wonder if there's like a low level trade, 6th, 7th they could chuck for a defensive tackle who can come and do a job for them. But I have no idea who that could be. Interesting times. Just a final note. Someone has said, like Brando and the whole forum thing said, why not start a Discord? Let me know in the comment section on the blog, in the article that's open for this stream, if you have any interest in that. And if you do, I'll consider it. Just let me know what you think. Anyway, thanks for Jeff's time. Thank you to everybody again for the super chats and good viewership numbers again for this. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do. Like the video. If you would do me the greatest favor of putting a comment in the comment section as well, even if you're in the live chat, because it helps promote the video, that would be much appreciated. SeahawksDraftBlog.com for more analysis on the draft and the Seahawks. Until next time, bye for now.